send them to you, but most of the ancient history ones we still have going on today. So hopefully we'll see you at some of the other ones this afternoon too. So we're starting off with Sabine Müller, who's going to talk to us about conquest and cultural property in the wars of Philip II and Alexander III. Over to you, Sabine.
Thank you, dear Graham, and thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and it was a pleasure. So I learned that James Bond's gun was not really his gun, and this was very interesting. And I saw some very good friends of mine in the audience. So hi to Jen, hi to Marek, hi to Carol. So I will start now. In modern and ancient times of war, why does it? The violations of cultural property of the defeated and appropriation as booty were common phenomena accompanying fights, sieges, defeat, and conquest. And for example, the Behistun inscription of the Persian king Darius the First mentions the universal problem of the preservation of cultural property and heritage, particularly in times of war. However, there were various types of treatment of cultural property of the defeated, depending on the situation, propagandistic value of the cultural property, or self-proclaimed image of the conquerors. Often the intruders used acts of violence as a method of shock and awe in order to demoralize and intimidate the opponent. Today, intentional violations against property in an armed conflict can be war crimes, for example, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity. But in antiquity, the attitude was ambiguous. Concurrently, with the practice of carrying off valuable artifacts as booty, there existed an ideological discourse about the appropriate treatment of the enemy's cultural property. And for example, Polybius favorably comments on Alexander's refraining from entering places dedicated to the gods during his campaigns. And we will see, as usual, in Polybius, it's not really all true what he writes, especially in case of Thebes. But it becomes clear that there existed a kind of unwritten moral code to avoid damaging, plundering, or destroying particularly sanctuaries, but also non-sacred artifacts carrying a symbolic value. And used as a marker of appropriate behavior, burning, damaging, stealing such objects out of greed or spite served to blacken the portraits of the protagonists in political discourse and in literature. An instructive example is Trogus Justin's biased view of Philip's role in the Third Sacred War. Because according to Justin Trogus, not Philip punished the evil Phocians, but he himself he went into the temples and he betrayed friends and foes alike, and he did not even spare temples. And the cult statues he apparently wanted to keep for himself as his spoils. And now I will try to categorize the damages done to the cultural property of the defeated in the wars of Philip II and Alexander III of Macedon. This is what I announced, but I have to say, I'm sorry, the paper will focus on Alexander, because when I did the research on Philip, there was not really much to find about material about Philip doing anything to the cultural property. So it will focus on Alexander. There is a categorization of violations against cultural property in times of war already by Sharok Razumju. He has categorized the damage caused by non-military persons without ideological motivation, then damage caused by invading armies, and then damage ordered by an authority motivated by ideological reasons. And focusing on point 2 and 3, I would like to develop the categorization of the treatment of the opponent's cultural property further, and I will try to categorize this as treatment of booty, including theft, then B, unintentional damage in the context of warfare, C, ideological or symbolic violence, and D, acts of retribution. And as a pattern for the intentions of Alexander's treatment of the opponent's cultural property, we will see that he did not have much in common with the Romans, who proudly displayed valuable artifacts from the defeated in public, namely in the Roman triumph. Alexander also did not adopt the Near Eastern war strategy to take away and hold captive the opponent's cult images in order to demoralize them. Most often during his campaigns, the damage done to the cultural property, including theft and plundering, do not simply occur as a sign of victory and visualization of conquest and annexation. Of course, this meaning was surely also there, but for him and his Macedonians, obviously, there was much more to it. And what we see here is the reception of his campaigns. This an explicit link between the collection of art and artifacts and conquest in the sense of the idea that possessing the works proved the possession of the places of origin is a major perspective of the times after Alexander's death. For example, here I listed some epigrams by Posidippus, and he flourished at the court of Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III. And there we have in his section on stones precious gems, former jewelry of high-ranking Persian men and women, and the gems changed hands and became tokens of conquest. However, if we look at Alexander himself, it was much more than a sign of victory. It was much more complex, and he seems to have been concerned with making the most of the immediate political usefulness of the cultural property. And these are the three major aspects I could discern, and sometimes they overlap. First, treatment as booty in order to pay, fund, or please others. Second, ideological or symbolic violence associated with ideas of retribution. And third, respectful treatment and preservation as a part of Alexander's appeasement policy. And as for point 3, for example, he cared for the tomb of Cyrus II twice, and he gave order to restore it after it had been pillaged. And on a Secretus reference to a reliable short Greek version of the epitaph of Darius I, maybe a hint that during his stay at Persepolis for 4 months, Alexander also took the chance to visit the royal tombs at Nakshi Rustam. I will now turn to the, for us, more interesting aspect, the damage done to cultural property. And as for point 1, theft, he funded the benefactions of his mother Olympias and full sister Cleopatra, acting in the interests of the Argead dynasty by sending them the booty take from the Persians. And he also tried to appease his Athenian allies and emphasizing that he was on a pan-Hellenic mission by sending panoplies to the Athenians after the Battle of Granicus. And reportedly, he also sent back statues of Greek origin he had found in the Persian treasuries back to Greek cities. And of course, he gave his soldiers the permission to plunder as a reward and in order to motivate them. And the prime example is, of course, the plundering of the treasure house of Persepolis in 330 BC. And we have the excavation report by Schmidt, and he shows that the Macedonians robbed what was valuable and easy to carry off and destroyed the rest. About 600 vessels from a great variety of stones were smashed, and they also scattered sculptures, jewelry, precious stones, and sacred objects. And some of the latter will have been recognizable as such even for foreigners, because a fire altar and a priest was depicted on it. And all the damage and destruction seem to mirror the rampant actions of a marauding soldiery, but given the pan-Hellenic propaganda of the campaign, the ideological background cannot have been absent. especially not in the treasury of Persepolis, given that in the palace area, Xerxes' buildings had been set on fire. Thus, the plundering of the treasury also belongs to the category 2, ideological or symbolic violence associated with ideas of retribution. Even more so as among the smashed vessels, there were items that carried Xerxes' name. So, while the unwritten moral code in mind, with the unwritten moral code in mind, that destroying the cultural property of the defeated, who even had surrendered in this case, was bad behavior, Curtius uses the Macedonian treatment of artworks in Persepolis as a sign of their loss of morals. Out of insatiable greed, they ripped statues off their bases, stole works of art, and hacked them into pieces in order to carry them off. Of course, his report is biased, but the excavation report confirms his description, and the find of an iron saw blade may confirm the information that the soldiers cut some objects into pieces to transport them. And as the excavator remarked, an iron saw was probably no item stored by the great king in his treasury. And we see also a Greek statue, the so-called Penelope from Persepolis, lay scattered in fragments in the ruins of the treasury. And the obvious Greek provenance of the statue did not save it from destruction. And it matches Curtius' description that they hacked something into pieces to carry the things off that were easier to transport. So this is no ideological idea behind, but a result of practical considerations. And Plutarch also tells an episode about a statue of Xerxes pulled accidentally over by plundering Macedonian soldiers who had forced their way into the palace. And if the incident was historical and happened during the plundering and conflagration of the palace, it may have been not so accidental, thus no unintentional damage in the context of warfare, but another example of ideological or symbolic violence. And in this regard, the prime example is, of course, the carefully arranged conflagration that affected only the parts of the palace identifiable as Xerxes constructions, primarily the Apadana and the Hadish. And as for the discussion about Alexander's probably various intentions addressing different recipients by this act, Jen Finn has recently introduced a very fascinating and convincing theory, and she characterizes the act as a deliberate ideological statement, quote, about Alexander's place in the dynastic history of the Macedonian and Persian royal houses by connecting himself to the legacies of Alexander I and Darius I. Now, perhaps we have another of these incidents. Sharok Razemju has suggested that the place area of Susa was also plundered by the Macedonians, although it's not mentioned by the Alexander historiographers. His assumption is based on the close examination of the varied forms of damage inflicted on the colossal statue of Darius I. And this statue, I hope you can see this at these photos of the. They showed multiple deep hacking marks and other damages, and he identifies them as signs of casual violence by target practice by bow and arrow, spear and sword. And Johannes Heinrichs suggests that rather than swords, some sling bullets may have hit the statue, and that also the Macedonians tried to chop off, you see the damage here, chop off the right hand of the statue that originally held the Achaemenid ceremonial sign of the lotus flower you can see on this relief here. And however, they failed and had to give it up because the stone is very hard. And in case it's not sure that the damages were done by the Macedonians, even if it looks like soldiers going berserk, it's hardly imaginable that there was no ideological background at all. However, it was likely not ordered by Alexander, because his order damages seem to have focused on the heritage of Xerxes, as Jen has emphasized. And this might be illustrated by the example of the Apadana relief of Persepolis. And again, Johannes Hannes has pointed out that this relief, showing the Darius on the throne receiving ambassadors, it was removed from the Apadana to the treasury, not by the Macedonians, but earlier on. And it may have been intentionally damaged by the Macedonians on Alexander's order, because you see this one here, it's Xerxes, or it's widely taken to be Xerxes. It has been erased. And in accordance with the Pan-Hellenic propaganda, it would have been clear to erase Xerxes. However, Alexander's policy of reward and retribution regarding the cultural property was not restricted to Asia. The sack of Thebes provides another example, because according to Pliny, Alexander took away a lamp holder suspending from the ceiling of the temple of Apollo at Thebes, an artful item. And contrary to the claim of Polybius that Alexander did not do any harm to Theban sanctuaries, he took property of the temple as booty. However, apparently in order to demonstrate that he did not mean to offend the god, but to punish the Thebans, he dedicated it to Apollo at Kyme. In this case, perhaps all three categories could be applied. First, treatment as booty in order to pay, fund, or please others, because Alexander intensified connections with one of the centers of the Aeolis, and he might have come there when he conquered the Aeolis in 334, so he might have come to Kyme. And Apollo, he was a major deity in the Aeolis everywhere, and especially Crinium was a center with a renowned sanctuary of Apollon, and there may have been reasons to appease the population there by dedicating the lamp holder to their main deity, because as the leader of the advance force, Parmenio, he had taken Grinium by storm in 336 and enslaved its inhabitants. So the Aeolians might have not been too enthusiastic about the arrival of even more Macedonians. Again, in addition, according to Arrian, Kyme formed part of some kinship diplomacy as an element of Alexander's contacts with Sidon. And according to their account, they were also from Kyme, and so they were Greeks in disguise. So perhaps Alexander's diplomatic contact with them was also furthered by his dedication to their main deity. Then, the ideological or symbolic violence. While the Macedonians engineered it, Thebes' destruction was officially decreed by a council representative of the Corinthian League, equipped with enemies and victims of Thebes. And we have the contemporary view of Aeschines that many Greeks thought that Thebes' fate was brutal but just. And so Alexander could also play the Pan-Hellenic card, punishing the descendants of the Thebans who had joined Xerxes' side during his Greek campaign, and punishing the Thebans who had been very bad to the other Greek neighbors. And we also have Arrian Diodorus report certain divine portents on the eve of Thebes' fall, foreshadowing its fate. And then we have the Delphic Apollo involved. And Diodorus states that travelers coming from Thebes claimed to have seen blood on the roof of the temple. So it was clear that perhaps Alexander could claim that he wanted to do what Apollo wanted from him. And he did not keep the lamp holder for himself, but exactly mirrored its earlier history by dedicating it to Apollo at another sanctuary. And we have another another episode from Thebes, Pliny tells us that Aristides of Thebes, known for depicting the feelings of persons, painted the capture of a town and a baby nursed by his dying mother. She feared that the baby might suck only her blood because she is dying. And Alexander removed this painting and took it to his palace at Pella. And this time, and this is really one of the only times I found, he kept a work of art taken from the defeated as booty for himself. And at first sight, this appropriation does not fit in with any of the three categories, but a closer look reveals that it can be seen as an example of free, respectful treatment and preservation as a part of Alexander's appeasement policy, because he paid respect to the Theban artist and his skills to capture real emotions in his works, and thereby he paid respect to the tradition of Argead patronage of artists, and as Francis Pownall has pointed out, this patronage served to affirm their Hellenic credentials and to display their high culture both within Macedonia and to the wider Greek world. And I created a table categorizing the damages done to cultural property of the opponent in Alexander's campaigns. And looking at it, it becomes clear that it was much more than booty to Alexander. It served multiple purposes, and mainly regarding the ideological justification of the war, or the appeasement of different persons and groups, and or the effort to gain acceptance. So, my last point. In contrast to the Roman practice, Alexander apparently did not visualize his expansion by exposing the cultural property of the defeated in the Macedonian public. He does not seem to have sent any Persian artworks to Macedonia to display them as spoils in public, or at least we don't hear anything about it. While he took the painting of Aristides and sent it to Pella, probably to his Argead palace, the admiration of Greek art formed part of the Argead tradition. For example, Archelaus hired the Greek painter Zeuxis to decorate his house. But overall, when it came to art and conquest, Alexander preferred to commemorate his victories by commissioning his own works of art. For example, the Granicus monument by Lysippus that was placed at Dion, right in the middle of the Macedonian public eye, or the famous Alexander with a lance also commissioned by Lysippus. And as monuments abroad testify to the power of the conqueror, accordingly, Alexander dedicated his portrait with the thunderbolt of Zeus, painted by Apelles in the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus. And we have an example, and here is Philip. Philip II commissioned a monument to commemorate his victory at Chaeronea and to show his gratitude to Zeus, but he did not place it in the area of the sanctuary of Zeus in Dion or elsewhere in Macedonia, but right in the middle of the defeated in Olympia. So, come to my conclusion. To Alexander, the cultural property of the opponent was much more than booty to carry away or to visualize his success. His different treatment of the property seemed to hint at a complex policy at work. He tried to address different groups of people and serve manifold aims, such as the appeasement of his soldiers, generals, and present or future allies, the visualization of the pan-Hellenic war propaganda, the funding of the benefactions of his Argead representatives at home, the ostentatious demonstration of respect regarding certain Persian monuments, or at least parts of it, if we think of the palace at Persepolis, in order to win over the Persian leading circles. So in short, Alexander's treatment of cultural property was relevant to his strategies of consolidation and legitimization. However, he seems to have used art and artifacts taken from the defeated mostly in the context of restoring to Greeks, for example, gift giving, funding, dedicating, or in the context of permissions to soldiers to plunder to keep them in a good mood. And the Theban painting was an exception. Alexander could demonstrate his Greek refinement by keeping it for himself and for his courtly society, of course. And as far as we can tell, he did not seem to have exhibited Persian cultural property in Macedonia as a sign of his victory, because when it came to art and artifacts commemorating his expansion, he chose to commission them himself, and he chose Greek artists that he trusted. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great. We do have 2 papers in this session, so I think we're going to keep our questions to the end. Just to make sure our audience who might have to leave can get through both papers, and then if we have questions, we'll resume them afterwards. So thanks, Sabine. We'll go straight on to Carlo Lualdi, and he's going to talk to us about Alexander the Great's conquests from Anatolia to Apulia, sketches, connections, and codes. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I will share my screen. Can you see it?
Yep. Yep. You got it.
Okay. So, I'm very deeply grateful for the warm welcome extended by Professor Wrightson at this interesting academic event. Today, my aim is to present an alternative perspective on the iconographic representations of warfare images, commonly referred as the Battle of Alexander. More specifically, my analysis will focus on the surviving visual depictions of Alexander the Great's victories that allowed the King of Macedonia to conquer the Persian Empire. The iconographic consequence of the conquest, which will be analyzed in this study, will show how cultural developments linked to historical warfare may bring artistic outcomes in contexts which are apparently not directly linked with the political and military events to the conflicts. It is particularly noteworthy that extant visual representations of these events are scarce and dispersed across different geographical contexts. Recently, researchers from the University of Udine have suggested that some fragmentary monumental rock reliefs discovered near the site of Tel Golmel may commemorate Alexander's victory at the Battle of Gaugamela. However, these reliefs are still unpublished, so it's not possible to verify this hypothesis. Conversely, the term Battle of Alexander is immediately associated with the renewed large-scale mosaic discovered in the House of the Faun in Pompeii. Despite this widely accepted chronology, the chronology, the provenance, and the subject of the mosaic still remain subjects of scholarly debate. Among the most well-known examples of the Battle of Alexander imagery are the battle scenes and combat depictions sculpted on the celebrated Alexander sarcophagus, or the sarcophagus of Abdalonimus, unearthed in the royal necropolis of Sidon and dating to the late 4th and the early 3rd centuries BCE. It is, however, to stress that the compositional schemes and the artistic traits of the sculpted decoration of the sarcophagus seems to evoke the idea of a series of events taking place during Alexander's campaigns, rather than celebrating the deeds of the King of Macedonia. By a certain perspective, it can be argued that Alexander's campaigns can be described as the sculpted background useful to enrich with an historical frame the deeds of the deceased. Furthermore, representations of the Battle of Alexander also appear on 3 Apulian red figure volute craters found in a context of the Apulia region, the southeast region part of the hill of the Italian peninsula. One of the most significant depictions appears on one side of an Apulian red figure volute crater attributed to the painter of Darius, dated between 340 and 320 BCE, and currently housed in the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. This monumental vessel was originally discovered in a tomb near Ruvo di Puglia, approximately 35 kilometers northwest of Bari, in Peucetia, a sub-region in central Apulia. The crater from Ruvo features a large-scale battle scene commonly referred to as the Battle of Alexander and Darius. As you may see, in the center of the composition, you can see Alexander charging two Persian infantrymen, and near the lac, the gray lac of the vase, you can see the 4 horses, which are led by a driver, and technically in the lac there was the figure of Darius. This representation is often interpreted within the propagandistic framework of King Alexander I of Epirus, uncle of Alexander the Great, who conducted military campaigns in southern Italy between 334 and 330 BCE to support the Greek city of Taras against the indigenous populations of the region. Some scholars claim that by referencing to the exploits of Alexander the Great, the local communities of Peucetia may have sought to affirm their political and strategic alignment with Alexander of Epirus. While the battle on the Ruvo crater is depicted with a remarkable detail, another Apulian red figure root crater with a similar theme survives only in fragments, now displayed in the Archaeological Museum of Altamura. These museums were found in the so-called Tomb of Agip, which were put in connection with Alexander with the burial of Alexander of Epirus. Since the burial was already looted in ancient times, it is impossible to verify this hypothesis. In addition, some fragmentary drawings also testify the existence of a third vessel, once part of Hamilton's collection but now lost. This vessel has been linked to the production of the underworld painter, and the chronology is near to the painter of Darius. Due to the incomplete nature of the latter examples, my analysis will focus primarily on the root crater currently exhibited in Naples and coming from Ruvo di Puglia. Before proceeding with my analysis, I would like to highlight an historical detail that establishes a direct connection between Alexander the Great's campaign in the east and the military activities of Alexander of Epirus in Apulia. Indeed, according to Marion, shortly before the Battle of Issus that took place in the autumn of 333 BCE, Tauriscus may be a member of Alexander's armed force, Alexander's courts, or Alexander's staff, and befriended Harpalus, the treasurer of Alexander the Great, whom he persuaded to flee from Alexander's camp shortly before the battle. Harpalus and Tauriscus reached Greece, but then Tauriscus moved and reached Alexander of Epirus in southern Italy, where he died. This brief historical note suggests the existence of a long-distance route, or possibly multiple routes, linking the Eastern Mediterranean to the Italian peninsula, the Eastern Mediterranean basin to the Italian peninsula. Despite the ongoing conflict between Alexander and Darius, this route remained open, facilitating not only travel and trade, but also the transmission of cultural and artistic influences. It is plausible that this network played a role in disseminating news and imagery associated with Alexander Macedon victories. The battle scenes depicted on the Apulian vessel that I mentioned before clearly illustrates Alexander's attempts to engage Darius in close combat, an episode that occurred on 2 occasions, at the Battle of Issus on 333 BCE and at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. These representations must therefore postdate Alexander's victories and likely were realized after the arrival and the death of Tauriscus in Apulia. The iconographic similarities between this depiction and other artistic work suggest that this route may have been used by individuals, potentially including craftsmen, veterans, ambassadors, and other people who facilitated the transmission of this visual motif. A comparative analysis of the Apulian craters and other works of art reveals a strong adherence to the compositional scheme characteristic of the Battle of Alexander iconography, albeit with some variants in detail as the number of the figures and specific gestures. A particularly illuminating comparison can be drawn between the battle scene of the Ruvo crater and the sculpted battles depicted on the sarcophagus from Sidon. Here, I just want to point out the few differences which can be observed on the vessels and on the drawing. As you can see, for example, the cuirass of the horseman is different. In this case, is an anatomic cuirass, while this is a corselet cuirass. Here, there are two different types of terrages. And in this case, for example, there is the luck of the first Oriental infantryman who is trying to use his axe against Alexander, while in this case there are two infantrymen, and as you can see, the type of the shield of the peltay shields used by the infantryman on the right is different. Here there is a sort of a rim, a central rim, while in this case this rim is lacking. The same again, in this case, I want only to show some differences in the submission scene, which show an Oriental infantryman which is almost lying on the ground with his knee, and who is trying to escape from the offensive action of a Macedonian, probably. As you can see, there are very few details which differs. Which make the difference among these iconographies. So, like for example, the warrior is not wearing any cap, while here is wearing a Frisian cap. And in this case, there is another Frisian cap, but without this kind of leather strap, which can be seen easily. So. A particularly illuminating comparison can be drawn between the battle scene on the roof crater and the sculpted battles depicted on the sarcophagus from Sidon. Both compositions share key visual elements, including a central mounted combatant turning backward, infantrymen engaging with cavalry, warriors raising their shields, and scenes of submission. This parallel suggests that the presence of shared artistic models that circulated between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western artistic tradition in a multi-layered and complex cultural interplay. To further investigation of this hypothesis, I will compare the Apulian vessel with two additional representations found in the Salento Peninsula, the southernmost part of the Apulia region, also called Messapia. These include the sculpted decoration on a limestone square base from Ugento and two limestone slabs from the Palmieri Pogeum in Lecce. These two artworks are rarely mentioned in the academic literature, and only recently Francesco Gabellone, Lorenzo Mancini, and myself provided some new analysis about this remarkable evidence, part of the Messapian artistic culture. The limestone square base from Ugento, discovered in the 18th century and now housed displayed in the National Museum of Taranto, depicts combatants engaged in various battle maneuvers and military actions, including infantrymen clashing their shields and mounted warriors confronting foot soldiers. It is interesting to stress that one of the sides of the base shows an horseman dismounting from his mount to fight on foot. Dated to the late 4th or the early 3rd century BCE, this artwork may commemorate military exploits associated with the deceased, although its precise historical reference remains uncertain due to the numerous conflicts that occurred in the Salento region during this period. Similarly, the sculpted frieze from the Palmieri Ipogeum in Lecce, which decorates the stepped corridor of a Messapian chamber tomb, has been interpreted as a memory of historical conflicts involving Apulians, Greek settlers, and military leaders coming from Greece or Epirus. Scholars have traditionally linked these reliefs to the campaigns of either Archidamus III of Sparta or Alexander I of Epirus, both of whom were invited by the city of Taras to counter the indigenous threats. Stylistic analysis places the frieze execution between the late 4th and the early 3rd centuries BCE, with influences linked to the Attic, Tarentine, and Macedonian artistic traditions. In my doctoral research, completed at the University of Warwick in 2024, I conducted a detailed study of the Ugento base and the Lecce friezes, identifying connections between their iconographic models and artistic trends originating in Tarentum, Macedonia, mainland Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean context. In a comparative examination of these artworks with the Ruvo craters reveals compositional parallels, particularly in the organization of battle scenes and the positioning of the combatants. By comparing the large battle scene found at Ruvo di Puglia with the sculpted decoration of the square base from Ugento and the slabs from Lecce, it's possible to observe notable similarities and recurring motifs that establish a connections among these three works of arts. It's important to emphasize that the two slabs from Lecce display a trapezoidal compositional scheme similar to the iconographic arrangements found in the two register of the Apulian vessel. Additionally, it is worth noting that the two groups of three combatants positioned on the left and the right margins of the two compositions can be described in analogous terms, as they convey similar military concepts with only minor variations. More specifically, on the left side of both representations, a horseman on horseback is depicted charging an infantryman in a great difficulty, who is supported by another infantryman brandishing his shield to protect his comrade. Similarly, on the right, a mounted combatant attacks an infantryman portrayed in distress, alongside another foot soldier, including a figure raising his shield. Furthermore, the presence of defeated infantrymen raising their arms or shields is a recurrent element in both artworks. Another motif linking the two pieces is the depiction of a single combat scenario in which an infantryman on the left is attacked by an horseman approaching from the right. These compositions also exhibit recurring elements that are repositioned and repeated within the two artistic works. Turning to the square base from Ugento, it is essential to highlight that the first two sides on the left replicate the compositional schemes observed on the vessel from Ruvo and on the slabs from Lecce. In contrast, the remaining two sides present a distinct arrangement characterized by a written pattern composed of two parallel oblique lines. Additionally, the base from Ugento incorporates certain motifs from the Ruvo vessel, albeit mirrored, slightly altered, and occasionally condensed. For instance, the depiction of two infantrymen overlapping the shields appears only once on one side of the square base from Ugento, whereas it is represented twice on the vessel from Ruvo. Another iconographic motif shared by both artworks is the image of a horseman either dismounting or already dismounted in order to engage in combat on foot. Furthermore, it is noteworthy that the placement and the sequence of the single combat scenes differs between the two works. The fights are represented as single autonomous narrative units, which can be displayed as single paintings in a gallery. It can be useful to quote Holscher's words about the artistic tradition of large battle scenes in antiquity. Battle scenes of the classical period, whether mythical or contemporary in their subject matter, whether in a large-scale painting or on vases, had broken up the event into single combats. Each figure is related exclusively to its immediate opponent. The individual combat groups, however, not stand in a realistic relationship to each other. If warriors on the same side face in different directions and have opponents both in front of and behind them, this cannot be interpreted as an overall tactical situation. Each combat group is arranged on its own. The spatial relations between the figures are meant to be real only insofar as they comply with the direct actions of the figures. This given expression to that immediacy of human interaction which characterized the idea of individual and action in the early Greek epochs. In summary, the three artworks from Ruvo, Ugento, and Lecce can be described as both as part of a common artistic tradition which exhibited various artistic experiences linked to a specific cultural, geographical, and cultural context, and showing a high degree of flexibility in the adaptation of visual representations. It can be argued that the primary objective of these artistic productions was to convey messages associated with military virtues and victories, rather to depict or commemorate specific battles or conquests led by a military commander leading his troops in the far east of the Mediterranean basin. In conclusion, this analysis has brought me to argue that the military victories of Alexander III of Macedonia in this campaign against Darius III of the Persian Empire, which culminated in the conquest of the Persian Empire, facilitated dissemination of military imagery that was subsequently received, assimilated, and adapted in Apulia, thanks to a cultural network extending from the Italian peninsula to the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin. As previously emphasized, the depictions of the battle scenes found in Peucetia and Messapia, linked to the military theme known as the Battle of Alexander, reflect a complex and multifaceted artistic environment that show a large number of different but also strong noticeable links. Moreover, it can be also noticed that while the images found in Peucetia can be linked to a unique iconographic model shown with slight modification, on the other side, the representations from Messapia show a more elaborate reception of the iconographic scheme that differs widely also between the Messapian settlements of Ugento and Lecce, two urban centers both located in the Salentine Peninsula. Thus, the visual representation from Peucetia and Messapia attest to distinct dynamics of reception, appropriation, and adaptation of iconography usually associated with the eastern campaigns of Alexander the Great. Consequently, this image may suggest the existence of multi-layered and dynamic cultural network that interconnected the Mediterranean basin. This hypothetical reconstruction enhances our understanding of the artistic development that unfolded in Peucetia and Messapia during the transition from the late classical to the Hellenistic period. Ultimately, the visual narratives serve as a significant exemplars of battle scene imagery associated with historical warfare, offering insight into the artistic transformation of a specific iconographic scheme depicting large battle scene produced across the Mediterranean. This reconstructed framework contributes to a more nuanced understanding of the precious artistic context in the Italian peninsula during the transitional phase between the late classical period and the emergence of the Hellenistic visual culture. Ultimately, these images serve as a valuable case studies for examining the evaluation of a large-scale battle iconography within the broader Mediterranean artistic tradition, illustrating both the continuity and the transformation of martial imagery between the 4th and the 3rd century BCE. Many thanks for your attention.
Great. Thank you. Two very interesting presentations. We can go straight into our questions for either of our speakers. Anybody want to start us off? Yes, John?
Question for Sabine. With Alexander's army, how routinely were they paid in loot? Was that the way that they were paid, or how common is that for that army?
Oh, I would love to give the question over to Graham because I think he knows better. But I think we know very little about the mistors of the army exactly. There's a very large discussion on it. And we have some snippets that the soldiers really expected to get booty and to get the permission of plundering regularly, but we are not really informed what regularly really means precisely. But I bet Graham, he is really the expert on Alexander's army, can do better than I. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, again, we don't really know, unfortunately, but it's an interesting topic, that's for sure. Yeah, Jeff?
Oh, yeah, I have a question for Sabine. Thanks for that really interesting presentation. It reminded me the way that Alexander seemed to target Xerxes and not Darius, about how Aeschylus and the Persians seems to forget that Darius also ordered an invasion of Attica. And similarly, Darius ordered an invasion of Macedon as well in Mardonius's failed campaign. So is there a connection between the two in Aeschylus and with Alexander, or do you think they come to favoring Darius at the expense of Xerxes kind of independently?
Yeah, this is exactly what Jen was discussing, and I cited her because she thinks that's a part of the family history, because one of the generals of Darius, his son Bubaris, married into the Argead house, and she thinks that this was preserved as a kinship tie in the Argead house, and I think that she's right. And that they remembered this positively, and really then the reception of Herodotus. I think that this is the main source they were always referring to, that they remembered Herodotus very selectively, that Alexander I, of course, was not really a willing ally of the Persians, and but in the end, Xerxes was the bad one, and Darius was the one who sent the general who became a relative. So they were really they making their own history. And of course, if you look at Herodotus, this cannot be true, but it was their kind of history, so it was propaganda. Yeah. And I think not Aeschylus, I don't know if they were really into him, because, well, they had Euripides, and he was writing for Achilla also. They had a Greek tragic poet, and perhaps he was enough. So
Thanks, and I see Jen is here too, so I'll apologize to Jen for not reading.
Sean, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. When Sabine was changing slides, with her three-part model, booty to redistribute, symbolic acts of retribution, what was her third category?
Hi, Sean. Nice to see you, first of all. My third category was the preservation and conservation in order to appease the conquered Persians.
Great. I have a question for Carlo, actually. Do you, in terms of this, you make a good case for this being in that region. Do you see these similar Alexander the Great battle motifs in other areas of Italy or the Magna Graecia?
Yes, in this case, for example, did not include it in my analysis. For example, the Etruscan urns showing a lot of these what we call the so-called Battle of Alexander schemes, which show a Norseman attacking a person on a chariot who is fleeing. They are dated slightly after the image in Piucezza and Messapia. It could be interesting to see why they put these images on Etruscan urns. We should consider that there was a military leader in Etruria that was linked to Alexander the Great, and they want to testify their adoption, their alignment with this military leader. Naturally not. So this is naturally a sort of impossibilia in order to say pay attention of our biases and the risk of overinterpret what we are seeing in this case. Yes, and also it should be we should be warned also by the images coming from the Lycian temples. Sorry, the Lycian Naiskoi. So like Sanctos and the various sculpted decorative apparatus which show some of these models, and this is like the experience, that artistic experience of the sculpture that took place in the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin, but which can be compared to the western. So there was a connection in a way or another, and it is something that is not really analyzed, and I think that it should be, because we came from a tradition which put in connection simply the vast majority of the images with the Greek tradition. But we should remember that we are in a time where it was Macedonia center the world. So like Lysippus and the painters, Apelle, which were at the court of Macedonia, which were from Greece, but they went in Macedonia, and they went also in southern Italy. Lysippus went to Taranto, to Taras. He set up a monumental statue of Zeus. So we should Heracles probably. Sorry. So we should pay more attention about the previous view of this iconographic studies because, for example, in this case, we can see the reception of the Messapian culture of a specific team, which is represented, but not in connection with Alexander the Great. They adapted to their own interests, to their own interests. So it's basically it's something that is very intriguing and very difficult because sometimes I also say, but it is what you are seeing or you want to see this. So I try to be careful. In this case, I think that we see an exceptional example of this kind of adaptation that was not previously noticed. It is interesting the question is why this kind of connection was so different between Messapi and Pechezia, because in Pechezia they were very similar to Alexander, while on Messapia they were completely different. So it's something that it should be very carefully evaluated. And I think that it is very important because Tauriscus and the Battle of Alexander are three events, to be honest, which are very near, but show that Tauriscus was able to reach Italy, and then the Battle of Alexander was able to reach Italy. But about these roads, we see these two contexts as isolated. So in this case, little by little, it could be possible to trace back a better view of the ancient Hellenistic network, because it was probably more linked. The Eastern and the Western were more connected in comparison of what we are used to think. So I hope that I answered to your question.
Yeah, for sure. Do we see any in Sicily too, in like that area of
Sicily,
Greek
it's something. It's a case that's quite isolated during this time, because Sicily will be involved in Pyrrhus campaigns that is a little bit after these events. It could be an interesting idea to include also Sicily, because I've noticed some coins minted in Sicily which show the scheme of the horseman looking back, crushing a infantryman who is on the ground. So it's very similar to the sarcophagus of Abdalonimus. So it is interesting. It could be absolutely interesting to reconnect also the island of Sicily, because it was one of the main contexts that very often is underestimated, with some Basilei which were able to make some political and tactical arrangements with the Diadochi and the successor of Alexander and other military leaders. But sometimes we consider Sicily as not not a kingdom which can stand with the other. Probably in the past it was not one of the biggest, but one of the most relevant. Yes. So it could be, yes. I think that in Sicily, based on my experience, it could be useful to deepen the topic with the coinage, because monumental battle, I have not memory of this. I remember the horseman battle of Agathocles, but it was a painting. And we have not any kind of this representation still surviving. Also, this is interesting because the Battle of the Horsemen, so the Battle of Chivalries of Agathocles, it precedes the Turma Alexandri. So the statue of the cavalrymen who fight at the Granicus battle, depicted on horseback, and we have the marble copies of them that are part of the British and the part in another museum, I think Leeds, if I remember well, and it is very interesting because we link the idea of the victorious horseman to Alexander the Great, but Agathocles was a little bit before. So it's interesting also to notice this kind of models which we are used to link to a specific figure, which can be a little bit interesting to deepen. Because again, I remember this coin from, I don't know which was the city, but it is exactly the same fight of the horseman looking back to against an infantryman which is already defeated. So again, we have some biases and some models which are strong, but we should pay more attention now that we have more studies and more evidence which can be read and seen in order to have a more updated view of the context.
Great. Sean, you want to ask something else?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna turn off my little raised hand thing. Carlo talked about Greek and Macedonian connections between Phoenicia and the West that might have helped artistic motifs go between the Darius painter and the sculptor of the Apollon sarcophagus. What about Phoenician connections? I mean, obviously the Phoenicians were still going back and forth between Phoenicia and Punic Sicily and the West, and there are people like Callias of Arados that you could look at as Greek or Phoenician depending on how you chose to frame them.
Sorry, have you finished? Oh, okay. Yes, well, in this case, I think that it could be interesting to deepen these connections, despite, to be honest, I don't found during my research some parallels due to the fact that the lack of monumental images and the fact that it's very difficult to date precisely the images to these chronological horizons, which is between Alexander and the Diadochi. Absolutely, I think again that, for example, I did not mention Egypt, but also Egypt, we should remember that was under the Achaemenid Empire, and after it became a kingdom of a kingdom ruled by one of the successors of Alexander, Ptolemy.
Yeah.
So and we have some influences of the Macedonian and Hellenic culture in the figural culture of that. In Egypt, and usually they are literally not known because Egypt is only related to the pharaoh. So, but the pharaoh before the conquest of the Persian and before the conquest of Alexander the Great. So again, it could be useful to deepen this kind of connections. In this case, I stressed that one of I found that the Lycian monuments, the Lycian funerary monuments, literally precedes a lot of these models. And I said in my paper that. The most important connections should be noticed also if they contradict what we think before, not to destroy what we believe, simply to update. And I want to focus on the concept of artistic experience, because I can be a leader in Lycia. And I can ask to a Greek craftsman to embellish my Naiskos. Okay, but I will ask him something that is related to my culture. So the final outcome will be a compenetration of the artistic skills and my request and the ability of the craftsman. So the Hellenic art experience of Lycia is not entirely Hellenic, is influenced by some other traits. So rather than the style, I would call these the various experience, so the Apulian experience, the Peucetian experience, and so in this case, it could be useful to see the common traits and the differences between these kind of experience. And by putting them, we would have a mosaic, which is part of the same mosaic, but every single piece has its own identity, and all together provide the outline that help us to have a better comprehension, because often I read that Peucezi and Messapia were the periphery of the Hellenistic world, but in this case they were connected with the heart of the Alexander kingdom and empire. So by showing a fight that took place in the middle of Asia Minor. So I think that it's really interesting to try to develop this new information. Also, I noticed that they found a new pieces of the Naiscos of Xanthos, the Nereid monument, so-called, that is now at the British Museum. They found a new fragment, like I think 5 years ago. So it's like there is also something to find out again. So I think that what you have said is absolutely correct, but in this case I noticed this kind of connections because I tried to trace like a limit also due to the fact that the number of the images in this case can be easily put all together. Definition, for example, pay the fact that it is more difficult to have a precise catalog, for example, or a precise study of their military representations, because as we know, Phoenicians were more related to other kind of activities. So it's possible, naturally, and it could be a useful hint for new studies, absolutely, and also for the Punic, naturally, in the same way.
Yeah, but there's definitely some recent research on like the tyrants of Syracuse as models for Philip and Alexander, although someone like Sabine or Graham would be able to talk about it better than I can. Yeah.
Good. I have a question for Sabine too, actually, before we end. I'm sure I should know the literature on this, but I unfortunately don't. But do you think that Alexander is consciously aping the Cyropaedia and Cyrus the Great in terms of his treatment of conquered religions when he's going through Persia, or is that not because part of his
No,
education?
I think that the Alexander historiographers make him look like this, of course. But what he tries to do, I think, he wants to have some Persian role model that was accepted also for the Persians. And what better to take than the founder? And he knew that Cyrus II was still admired, adored. There was his cult at Pasargadae. So he took Cyrus II and paid his respect to him. But all that he did, like Cyrus II, I think this was really artificed by the primary Alexander historiographers and some secondary, like Plutarch. Plutarch loves Xenophon and his Cyropaedia, and Plutarch really reinforced this. So
you think it's just in the sources, not in terms of Alexander doing it?
Not to this extent as in our sources. He was a politician, not someone who loved books.
Okay, interesting. Good. Any other questions?
One more. Yeah.
Yep. Jeff
For
has a question.
Sabine again. Yeah. It occurs to me, have you looked beyond once Alexander gets further east? Because I know he's much more kind of brutal in his treatment. The further east he moves beyond Persia, but specifically with kind of how he treats religious sanctuaries, or kind of how your scheme fits. Have you looked that far, or do you have any kind of premonitions if you haven't?
Yeah, you are referring to the Branchidae, I think. Yeah, of course. Yes, he tried to dedicate something to the local deities as long as the people cooperated. And if the people didn't cooperate and if they resisted against him, and in this very really problematic stage, he also he didn't he wasn't paying any more respect if it wasn't really necessary. He tried really this shock and awe strategy as Anson has put it, and the further he went east and the more insistent the resistance against his rule was, then also the more brutal he became. And well, yeah, so I would agree to you.
Thank you.
Great. Any last questions? If not, thanks both our speakers for. Oh, you have a question, Caroline? Do you have a question, Caroline?
Sorry, no, I just want to make, I made an error. The Conquests of Agratocles was after Alexander. I was referring to the coins minted in Sicily, which show frequently horsemen, which can be considered an emphasis on the mounted forces. So I made a little mischronology of the two concepts. I just want to add it because I check it very quickly, and because there was something wrong to ring a bell. So I say, sorry, it's better to say it before.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
thanks
No
again
problem.
to both our speakers, and we'll resume after lunch in about an hour for our Hellenistic East Bactria session with Ben and others. So hopefully, we'll see some of you this afternoon. Thanks
Enjoy,
again.
Graham.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Do you ask something, Sean, or you just?
Just say goodbye.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, we'll see you later.